This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. What you're watching is quieter than that and far more dangerous, because when systems fail loudly, they get fixed. When they fail slowly, they get normalized. Right now, power is moving in a way most people aren't trained to notice. Not through elections, not through laws being repealed, but through habits, through exceptions that stop feeling exceptional. You're being told this is chaos, drama, noise. It isn't. It's a stress fracture inside the machinery that decides who can use force, who can declare emergencies, and who, if anyone, gets to say no. And here's the part that matters. Once this kind of shift becomes routine, it doesn't matter who's in charge anymore. Stay with me, because to understand where this goes, you first have to see what quietly changed and why almost no one stopped it. And that change didn't start yesterday. For a long time, people believed the system was controlled by rules. Written limits, checks that clicked into place when power went too far. That assumption is now outdated. What actually governs the system today isn't ideology or party, it's momentum. The speed at which decisions are made before anyone can interrupt them. Power no longer waits for consensus. It moves first, then dares the rest of the system to catch up. This is the quiet inversion most people miss. Oversight hasn't been removed, it's been outrun. When authority acts faster than institutions can respond, legality becomes secondary. Not abolished, delayed. And delay is all power needs. That's why the loudest fights you see don't matter as much as the silent ones you don't. The real control isn't who wins the argument. It's who sets the tempo. And once the tempo accelerates past a certain point, resistance starts to look like disloyalty instead of duty. That's when systems stop protecting themselves, and that's when the real shift begins. The most dangerous changes never announce themselves. They arrive as updates, adjustments, temporary measures that never quite roll back. There was a time when extraordinary power felt heavy, rare, something leaders hesitated to touch because using it came with cost. That time is gone. Now exceptions arrive already normalized. Emergency authority isn't framed as alarming, it's framed as efficient. Before, power waited for permission. Now permission is assumed and objections arrive late, buried under the next development. This is how systems drift without appearing to move. Each step feels rational in isolation. Together, they redraw the map. And here's the trap. When something works once, it becomes precedent. When it works twice, it becomes practice. When it works often enough, it becomes invisible. No vote is taken to approve that shift. No announcement is made. It simply settles into place. By the time anyone realizes what's changed, the old version of the system already feels naive. And that's when the first real shock hits, not as a cause, but as a symptom. Then the system flinched. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way it hasn't had to for a long time. A formal barrier was raised, not as symbolism, not as messaging, but as a procedural stop sign. This wasn't about rhetoric. It wasn't about tone. It was about force, specifically who is allowed to threaten it, who is allowed to initiate it, and whether permission still matters before the machinery starts moving. The shock wasn't the threat itself. Threats happen all the time. The shock was where it was pointed and what that implied about alliances that are supposed to be untouchable. Behind closed doors, alarms went off, because once force is discussed as an option, even casually, the system treats it as real. Plans get drafted. Responses get modeled. Trust starts recalculating. If you're still with me, good. Because this moment wasn't about stopping anything. It was about buying time. And what happens next depends entirely on how the system actually works when no one is watching. Here's the part no one talks about. When the system flexes, it doesn't just bend, it favors. And in this case, it's favoring one group, while the rest absorb the consequences. The system, in all its complexity, isn't an equal playing field. It's a field where some players understand the game more than others, and that makes all the difference. The War Powers Act isn't just a law, it's an escape clause, a backdoor into executive action, a bypass to circumvent the typical delays of congressional approval. When it works, it consolidates power. When it doesn't, it shifts blame. So who benefits from this? Not the public. Not the ordinary voter who expects the system to protect them, not even the allies who rely on trust. The ones who benefit are the ones who can move quickly, the ones who can absorb the costs of delay, the ones who control momentum. The rest of us, we're left playing catch-up. When you don't know the rules, you're always a step behind. And that's how systems fail, not with a bang, but with an unanswered question. It's happening again, and faster this time. The emergency declaration, the bypassing of law, the same playbook, executed with no hesitation. Each time, the threshold for what qualifies as an emergency gets lower, and each time, the action gets broader. This isn't just about what's being done, it's about what's being normalized, what's becoming the new baseline. Every decision that sidesteps the system strengthens the narrative that the system is the problem. And every time that happens, the emergency gets more convenient. It doesn't matter if the issue at hand has been building for years. It doesn't matter if the crisis is manufactured or manufactured quickly. The truth is, the system can no longer respond on its own terms. It reacts on theirs. Once you declare an emergency, the usual rules don't apply. And it starts to look like a tool, not an exception. The question isn't what happens now. The question is, when does this stop? Imagine this. You're living your life, managing your bills, watching the news, and you realize something. The promises made to you about lower costs, more stability, fewer wars, aren't matching up to reality. Instead of progress, you're seeing uncertainty. Instead of economic security, you're hearing about Greenland, oil crises, and military threats against allies. How does that feel? For the millions who voted hoping for predictability, for buying stability, it feels like a betrayal. You voted for a promise of economic security, not for rhetoric that sounds like the start of a war. Small businesses are watching too, wondering if their supply chains will even exist next year, wondering if they can still rely on contracts, investments, and the markets they depend on. If you're one of those people, how do you live with that? How do you plan for the future when you don't know if the ground beneath you will still be there next week? This isn't just a political story. It's your life, your future, and it's being reshaped while you watch. The rules of engagement are changing, and the question is, who's going to stand up for you when the rules no longer protect you? And the problem doesn't stop at the border. What happens here ripples across the globe, and it's already happening. NATO allies, those same countries who've stood with the United States for generations, are now recalibrating. Their trust is eroding. Their confidence in American commitments is shaking. When the U.S. threatens military action against an ally's territory, it's more than just a headline. It sends a signal to Europe, to Asia, to the Middle East. And here's the catch. Other powers are watching carefully. Russia amplifies the narrative. China calculates its moves. Iran waits for opportunities. This isn't about one country anymore. It's about the entire international order. How can anyone trust the U.S. to be a stable partner if American leadership itself is in question? How can markets trust the dollar when the very institutions that back it are crumbling under pressure? The dominoes are falling, but they're falling quietly. And the world is starting to question whether the old rules still apply. This isn't just a local crisis. It's a global recalibration, and it's only just beginning. There are three possible futures, but none of them look comfortable. First, we could see adjustment. Maybe this moment passes. Maybe the system finds a way to adapt. Institutions regroup, and some semblance of normalcy returns. It's happened before. But it would require an enormous amount of pressure and resolve from Congress and from citizens demanding accountability. Second, that we could see erosion, the slow collapse of the guardrails, not a sudden rupture, but a gradual wearing down of the system's integrity. Each new emergency declaration would get easier. Each new bypass would seem more justified. The power to act unilaterally becomes institutionalized. And with it, the notion that Congress doesn't need to approve every move. Or third M, the most dangerous path, we could see rupture, a complete breakdown of checks and balances. When institutions stop enforcing limits, the entire framework that keeps power in check falls apart. This wouldn't happen overnight, but once it starts, it could cascade. And when it does, the consequences won't just affect politics, they'll affect the very nature of democracy itself. None of these paths are certain, but each one is in play right now. And which one we end up on depends entirely on whether the forces resisting unchecked power hold their ground or buckle under the pressure. Here's the truth. The stakes are high, and no one can afford to look away. If the system bends, if it shifts slowly out of sight, it will take years to rebuild what was lost. If it breaks, the consequences will echo across generations. But here's the problem. None of this will be decided in the next news cycle. None of it will be settled quickly. So what happens next? Will the institutions hold? Will Congress assert its authority? Or will the flood of emergencies drown the system? Will you pay attention? Because the question isn't just whether this moment is fixed. It's whether we, as citizens, still have the power to fix it. It's up to you to decide how much of this you're willing to let slip by unnoticed. And that's a question we'll all have to answer. But right now, the danger is clear. Power without checks, unchecked power, what does not correct itself. So the next time you hear a story about an emergency declaration or a war threat, ask yourself, what happens when this becomes routine? Stay with me. This is just getting started.